Hello everyone. So the other day I picked up a copy of Antifa, the Antifascist Handbook. And it was a very good book. So basically I'm going to sort of do a mini review kind of thing. I'm going to go through some notes I put down, what I liked about it, what I didn't like about it. And obviously I'm not going to tell you everything that I learnt from it because that would kind of spoil it. So first up I'll say if you like if you're into politics, but you sometimes find things like Capital or Communist Manifesto, Conquest of Bread, if you find those kind of boring, because I know I very much I struggle to read those. Like, I like them and I'm reading through them, but I struggle because Jesus Christ, the language in them is boring. Um, I really recommend Antifa because it's a modern book. It's written quite simply and understandably, and overall it just really kind of lays things out in a good way. And it's also quite fun to read because a lot of the information is to the point, and I learnt quite a lot actually. Even though I've always kind of supported Antifa, I thought I knew about it, but I really didn't. So yeah. So one of my first notes is Antifa before the war. Now it's very interesting when it comes to that. It explained a lot of crap that I didn't know. This is going to be a common theme. It's explaining a lot that I didn't know. So before the war, there was sort of it explained anti-fascist action, even though it wasn't kind of a thing back then. It explained what anti-fascists were doing in Germany. So it points out that the splits in the left kind of led to a rise in fascism. They were too busy paying attention to each other, and they weren't fighting fascism, which is how Hitler came to power. And it pointed out that Oswald Mosley, he was incredibly similar to Hitler, and actually, Britain was going the same way as Nazi Germany in many ways until the Battle of Cable Street kind of diminished all support for them, which I found really interesting because that made me kind of. Beforehand, I'd always kind of agreed with hitting Nazis, but like, I didn't see the wider political implications of it. I just thought, well, they kind of deserve it, didn't they? They're a bit of twats. They want to kill half the world, so it's not gonna. It's the lesser of two evils, isn't it? Anyway, so yeah. But I found that very interesting because I didn't know that. In fact, I knew very little about Oswald Mosley, if I'm being honest. But yeah, the Battle of Cable Street happened. He lost a lot of support, and boom, the British Union of Fascists, I believe they're called. They were basically nothing after that. Also, I like it explains quite heavily how fascist tactics have changed. For example, pinstripe fascism, which is basically the evolution of fascistic politics into a more formal setting. So you could argue things like the Trump administration is fascistic, not necessarily fascist, although that's kind of up for debate. People like Le Pen, Farage, or whoever the crap taken over after him. But yeah, fascism is becoming more formal. So traditional Antifa is kind of losing its effectiveness because although it might be effective in the streets, fighting Nazi street gangs and stopping organisations that resemble more kind of Oswald Mosley and Hitler's fascists, that's not as good in the modern times because before World War II, fascists gained a lot of support in the street, but now they're becoming more and more formal about how they rise to power. So Antifa, not only do we need these street actions in case they try and rise up in the street again, but we also need to develop kind of formal tactics. And there's a great sort of paragraph on the possible tactics, which, not paragraph, even a whole chapter, and that's really interesting. That's really useful. Um, it's also quite interesting to see how Antifa in different places operates to deal with this new change. Um, so another thing that I found very interesting in the book was its analysis of the whole free speech argument, where people say punching a fascist is anti-free speech, and it makes you just as bad as them. Also, they say that being anti-free speech makes you a fascist. Well, I think this kind of highlights a lack of understanding on their part, really, because the definition of fascism has very little to do with restricting free speech. Fascism is often a aggressive, hyper-nationalistic kind of party that provides the party with an enemy. So it's not so anti-free speech, although that is actually very linked in with fascism. It's not one of the core tenets I've heard it being described as. It's more of a side effect. Anyway, that was a little tangent. So the whole free speech argument is pretty stupid because, as he points out, most people who put forward the free speech argument are actually anti-free speech. So many liberals are actually anti-free speech, or many conservatives as well. By liberals, I mean sort of the centrists. For example, if we apply, again, this isn't my original logic, this is something I've read in the book. If you apply sort of the ideas of free speech to something that we all agree is horrible, if we look at a rapist, does anyone believe that they should deserve free speech to go and espouse their views? Does anyone believe that they should deserve to go around the street telling people, oh yes, great, you should all do it? Because no, they don't. They believe they should be in prison, uh, maybe worse, it depends, but we all agree they don't deserve speech. Well, this is the problem, because conservatives, liberals, centrists, the author points out that they're actually anti-free speech as well, but they just pretend to be apolitical in their anti-free speech, even though it is actually political in some sense of the word, and whilst there's not much debate about whether rapists should be allowed free speech, it is still inherently political that they shouldn't. So the only difference then is that Antifa don't hide the political nature of their actions and they instead embrace them. They say, oh yeah, well, yes, we're anti-free speech for Nazis, but this is why. And it's because they actually endanger far more people by not taking action. And that's actually what we found out. In Nazi Germany, when the left didn't mobilise and didn't take action, Hitler happened. Whereas in Britain, Oswald Mosley was working in the exact same way as Hitler, in an almost identical climate, albeit a slightly richer one. The anti-fascists, although they weren't called that in that day, they practically stopped it with violence. So the point is that violence is valuable, it just has to be used correctly. And in fact, limiting the free speech is not as a heinous crime as people make it out to be, and is in fact an incredibly valuable method of self-defense for minorities. Here's another thing. Liberals often have an all-or-nothing understanding of fascism. They say, oh, well, someone will jump up and say, yeah, I'm Hitler, guys, let's all kill everyone, blah, 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 blah. Racial policies, all that crap, right? But actually, Hitler wasn't as explicit as that in his early politics. Fascism evolves, and there's many different types of fascism. So, for example, Hitler kind of went from a more traditionally nationalist view to a very much ultra-nationalist, horrendous Hitler we remember in history. And that's the same thing. Mussolini, who was also a fascist, had many different beliefs to Hitler. And Japan at the time was fascistic, and they had entirely different beliefs. So fascism is a wide variety, and it's also kind of a sliding scale. And it escalates and escalates. So whereas people think, oh, we're either entirely a fascist or we're not, you've got to ask them, well, how does that work? And I think this is kind of the logic they apply to World War II as well, when they say, oh, look, well, it was right to invade Germany and fight a war against them because they had a fascist government. But what they don't realise is that if they had have been fought before the fascist government was established, then World War II wouldn't have happened. So it's not about fighting them when they get into government, it's about preventing them from getting into government in the first place. Because when they do, the consequences are disgusting. Okay, I know this is getting horribly rambly now, but I'm just going to go on to strategy now, which is a very small part. I think this section was incredibly interesting as well. This has moved away from a book review to more of a paraphrase. I don't know. I don't know what this is anymore. This is really rambly. and really badly scripted. But anyway, so about strategy, what people think of Antifa is, oh, they're all violent, they're all violent. But that's because the mainstream understanding really thinks that Antifa is synonymous with Black Bloc, when they're not. Black Bloc is just a group of black-clad militants for the purpose of fighting, or intimidation, or protection of the main protest. Now, those can be employed in many situations, and whilst Antifa does use black blocs, Antifa and black bloc aren't the same thing, because Antifa is a political stance, and black bloc is a tactic. Black bloc is a tactic used by Antifa, but Antifa isn't explicitly and limited to black bloc. Antifa is in fact mostly non-violent, and they actually, well, I'm an anti-fascist and I want to do anything I can to avoid confrontation, as I'm sure many do. And whilst you do have those people who just want to fight and cause havoc, they're not the main face of our movement. They are just a subsection of it that, whilst useful in some situations, is kind of useless in others. Because a lot of anti-fascism is everyday anti-fascism, as the book points out, and a lot of it is just creating a culture where fascists are too scared to hold their beliefs, or too scared to try and convert other people to them. And this is far more effective than fighting them anyway. But what we have to keep in mind is that we need a diverse range of tactics, because fascism can come from anywhere. As we've seen, it has come from within the government officially, and it has risen to power from the streets as well. It's a very wide range of politics that all culminates into the same kind of horrible thing, but from different angles. So we need to defend every angle, because if just one fascist movement slips past and gains popularity, then, Nazi Germany happens again. So yeah. Anyway, that was my horrible random rambling from a bit of paper that I wrote and took notes down whilst reading a book. Haven't said all of them, because, quite frankly, it would be a disservice to the book to just go and explain all its points. Basically, go read it. It's really, really, really good. I recommend anyone with any kind of political interest read it, no matter what position you're actually on, be it left, right, authoritarian, or libertarian. I recommend that you read it just for a greater understanding of the movement and the history. And even if you think you know Antifa quite well, like I did, it's probably going to be very interesting because, firstly, you've probably only got an understanding of your local Antifa, and Antifa tactics across the globe vary wildly, as I found out, but also because you maybe don't know as much as you think you did, because Antifa didn't just rise in the 80s and 90s like many people think. It was kind of a thing all throughout the 1900s, up until modern times. And the book actually quite accurately details the rises and falls in Antifa, as it was necessary. And I just think it's hugely fascinating to find out the history. And also, I found it quite interesting. I learnt a lot more about fascism than I thought I would from the book. And again, because I was kind of a little bit ignorant, but I just think overall it's a great book. It's great to educate yourself on what the movement is, and it's honestly a really good read. It fascinated me, and I know a lot of my friends who would consider themselves apolitical have actually been borrowing the book. So yeah, I mean it's obviously just a very good book because I enjoyed it more than anything else I've ever read. So yeah. Anyway, thanks, watching, listening, whatever you're doing right now. Using as background noise. Thanks anyway, because the views help a tiny bit. Anyway, bye. Have a good day, comrades. Farewell.